Marina had learned to sleep anywhere, on a bench under a streetlight, in the back of a bakery between sacks of flour, with the city noise pressing like an indifferent hand against her skull. She had not planned to sleep in a penthouse. She had not planned anything that night except to survive until morning and not wake beneath the sharp eye of any landlord who counted nights and coins the way the law did not. The elevator had taken her higher than she usually allowed herself to look. The doors had opened to a corridor that smelled of cedar and a faint, sweet citrus that she later learned was a cologne reserved for people who had help peeling oranges and a staff to do it. For a little while, walking those polished floors had been a kind of a dare, a small rebellion against the way the world had shunned her. An omega, soft-furred and soft-footed, marked by birth as less than, a girl who had been given away when her mother had needed coin and pride more than a child, rusted into the role of invisible labor. She was used to being unseen. She was not used to the dizzying vertigo of standing in someone else's gold. She had slipped past a terrace door left slightly ajar for some gardener to fetch herbs in the morning. The sky over the city was a bruise that tightened into stars, and the penthouse's living room was a deliberate silence. Tall vases that held sculpted light instead of flowers, a couch so broad she could not imagine anyone falling from one end to the other without planning a descent. Exhaustion was a thing that erased shame, if only for a moment. Marina had curled up on that couch like a small animal, pulled the soft throw over her shoulders, and let the city spool out from her like thread. She fell asleep thinking the world had no business with her dreams. She woke to hands, big, warm, with a grip that did not try to bruise, but to assert an economy of force, the kind that would not ask permission of space because space obeyed it. Panic flared, a hot red animal. She was in a stranger's bed, in a stranger's home, on a couch that smelled like someone who never left for less than a week. Her heart tried to explain that she was still small, and that this was only another theft of her privacy. She tried to scramble away, fingers fumbling under the throw, but someone's arm tightened around her torso with efficient care, so old it felt like a memory not hers. "You slept like the dead," a voice said, close to her ear. It was rough-edged with cool command and something softer beneath, and it made the room reorder itself into a place of hierarchy. Marina froze, because to freeze was safer than to breathe. She tried to keep her jaw a useful muscle, and not an admission. In the sound of the voice, the world whispered of closed doors and people who did not speak to strangers because strangers butted into fates. The hand that had held her slid down and did not pry. He smelled faintly of cedar and of iron, like the inside of some ancient metal box that held little roses. When she risked opening her eyes, she saw him. He was not one of those wealthy men who softened at the edges with age. He was sharp, a jaw cut from glass and tempered in storms, a man chiseled so finely that the mind wanted to map the angles and then look away in deference. His hair was the color of midnight, and there was a scar that ran like a remembered river along one cheek. He sat at the edge of the couch, not fully in it, as if he practiced not becoming part of furniture he did not own, and he watched her with an attention that felt dangerous because it was not seeking pleasure but calculation. There were 100 cameras on that penthouse, and 100 attendants whose job was to notice. He noticed her. He also noticed, without a trace of melodrama, that she was shaking. "You're cold," he said. It was an observation and not a question. He rose, moved with a speed that measured itself like a predator's patience, and returned a blanket he must have fetched from some invisible closet. He wrapped it around her shoulders like an offering, and then sat back as if offering required an accounting. Marina's pulse kicked at the base of her neck, and with each breath she took in more of the sharp iron scent that clung to him. He was not merely rich. He was a central gravity. People's fortunes orbited him, orbits that often decayed into polite fear. "Where am I?" she asked. Simple words that tasted like a prayer. The answer did not come with the softness she had hoped for. He inclined his head like a man taking inventory. "My home," he said. "You were on my terrace." Her throat closed. It was not his house she cared for. The thought that dragged its talons across her chest was the question of why. Why had he not called the police? Why had he not ordered that she be removed by a butler with a face like marble? Instead, he had brought a blanket and sat and watched, as if watching would explain what he had found. He introduced himself the way people of his class introduced nothing. The name was not offered as a convenience, but as a verdict. "I am Aidan Blackthorne," he said. "I suppose you will want to leave." His voice had the accent of command, the kind that had shaped armies in boardrooms and shadows. For a second his eyes flashed, a color like winter-pressed glass. Then he looked almost bored. "But I will not have my property ruined tonight," he added, the humor brittle as old glass. Marina almost laughed. The joke stung. Property was a language she knew. People spoke it of her the way they spoke of windows. Useful, transparent, able to be closed. He watched the flash on her face, and when she felt the heat of his gaze, it was as if she had been skinned alive and someone was admiring the way the muscle shivered. "I have nowhere to go," she said. "You have options," he replied, and the words were like a scalpel. He had options because he was expected to, and she had none because she had been raised to be dispensable. When she thought of asking him for a room, the noise of 1,000 rejections crowded into her ears. Instead, she turned the admission into honesty. "I did not mean to trespass." He studied her with an intensity that seemed to compute the world fast enough to leave no loose ends. "Why are you so far beyond where you belonged?" he asked. There was a cruelty in the phrasing, a social calculus learned and applied without flourish. Marina tightened under the question. Who did she belong to? In truth, she belonged to no one and everyone. She belonged to the streets that had kept her safe and the hunger that had taught her to be silent. "It was a night," she said, and her voice shrank. "I could not sleep." Aidan's mouth thinned. For a moment, something like disdain hovered over him, and then he folded it away. He moved like a man who had rehearsed generosity until it was second nature. "You could have called down for a steward," he said. "You could have been escorted out. Instead, you made yourself small in my drawing room." There was an accusation in that sentence, or perhaps simply surprise. Marina wanted to tell him that the city did not allow her to call anyone except the ones who would charge for each breath. She wanted to tell him the names of the places that had kept her. The laundromat where she sometimes slept by the machines that hummed like late confessions. The soup kitchen that had a pot that tasted like onions and the patience of strangers. Instead, she said, "I'll go." The words were a surrender. He had not demanded anything. He had only observed. He did not ask her to move. He did not make the offer of restitution that magnates used like currency. A job here, a favor to be called in. Instead, he did something that was almost stranger, useful for reasons he himself would not admit. "You should not be out here by yourself," he said. "Are you unwell?" Marina swallowed because when people asked if she was unwell, they meant fragile, incompetent, a drain. She had been described by kind people as tired and by mean ones as broken. She held her breath and allowed him to examine her with the eyes of a man who was used to calibrating assets and liabilities. At some point, their roles shifted without either of them making a noise about it. She was not only a trespasser now, she was a curiosity. Curiosity has sharp teeth. "You smell of moonflower," he remarked, and the observation was impossible to place until she remembered that once, years ago when her mother still had her, they had used moonflower salves on her wrists to calm the tremors that came from evenings when hunger tightened like a fist. The memory was a small thing: sunlight through a cracked window, a mother who smiled with one side of her mouth. The scent anchored her for a moment to a life that had felt like a different mineral, one she could almost pick up and hold. "You should not sleep where you do not belong," he repeated. There was pity in his voice now, softer and more complicated than the cruelty before. Marina did not admit to how much it mattered that he cared. People pitied her in the street, wrapped words in velvet and thrust coin at her like a weapon. But pity in that room carried a trace of accountability that made her skin pull tight. "You can stay until morning," he said finally. It was a small thing, a concession and an edict. His decision closed around her like a lid. She felt grateful and humiliated, because nothing was free in a house like that. Free had a scent too, and it was never hers. She slept again, fitfully, under a blanket that smelled faintly like cedar and more strongly of money. When she woke in daylight, light had found the city and found her in it. She was not alone when she rose. A man with hair like frost and eyes that refused to leave hers stood by the terrace window. He had a presence that suggested policy, as if every detail of his being had been codified by regulations that had outlived their authors. He had lines at the corner of his mouth that told of disciplined anger. He was dressed in a suit whose tailoring had been sermonized by tailors to their apprentices. He was the kind of man who did not need to speak to declare status. Aidan watched her like a scientist observing a specimen he had not yet decided upon. "You are not ill," he said. It was not a question. He continued, the cadence of someone who dictated and therefore defined. "You were cold and tired, which are different forms of the same problem." "Thank you for the bed," Marina said. The words tasted stale. She tried to keep her hands useful and small, to not show the tremor she felt at being noticed. "I am leaving." "No," he said. The word landed like a gavel. For a second the world shrunk to the sound of it. "You are staying longer." He moved as if the choice had been obvious for some time, and she had only been slow to learn what he intended. "I have a guest coming tonight, and it would be inconvenient for you to be discovered sleeping on my terrace by someone who did not note kindness when they saw it." Her mind supplied 1,000 outrages. The first was the simple accusation. He had decided upon her future without so much as a discussion. The second was more delicate. She had learned to be invisible. Now she was to be hidden on purpose in his house, an act that felt less like safety and more like possession. "I do not want to be trouble," she murmured. "You will be no trouble if you obey a few simple rules," he said. He listed them like a man reading statutes. "Be quiet in the morning. Do not touch anything in the study. Do not leave the penthouse without informing security." The rules were edged with civility. They were the kind of civility that chased the weak like rabbits into holes. They made her small, but offered shelter. Shelter was a currency she had not known she would accept. He told her his assistant would bring her a room and that she would have breakfast at 9. His voice held a shape that made refusal feel like a moral wrong. Her throat tightened. She was an expert at saying no to doors and asking for the smallest of favors, but when the favor was offered on the terms of obedience, she found herself grateful. She learned the layout the way someone learns the anatomy of a building. The kitchen that carried the faint hum of machines and the human smell of early meals. The library so full of books she imagined entire lives hidden under leather. The private office with framed photographs that showed a man in controlled laughter. a man who could smile in public because the smile had been practiced. Marina was led to a room with pale linen and a window that opened to a view of the river. It was hers for the time being, which meant it was borrowed until the nights counted up and someone decided it was not worth storing. Living in someone's house a night at a time had rules she had not encountered before. The staff were professional and detached, and when they interacted with her, there was always a layer of distance that was taught, like a dance step. Marina learned to like the small ministrations. A clean towel, breakfast that did not taste of yesterday's regrets, a bath drawn with salts that hinted of someone else's vacations. These were pleasures she had only dreamed about, and in the shallow mirror above the dresser, she touched the face that had been made larger by sleep and the faint ghosts of hunger that never quite left her cheekbones. Her reflection was a study in contradiction, wild eyes above hands that had learned to make things small and useful. Aiden hovered at the edge of her mornings. He did not hover like a boss, with scrutiny and the rustle of power. He watched with something more subtle. When he came into the room, it was as if he had reduced the temperature of the entire space by 5 degrees. The air around him tightened with a kind of neat, cold electricity. Marina watched him unpack a briefcase with a precision that had the movement of ritual. She noticed small things. The way his hands trembled when he sorted papers late at night. The way he walked, as if he measured the distance between chairs and the truth. She watched and took inventory like a woman who had learned that knowledge could be armor. There were rumors in the city about Aiden Blackthorne. The wealthy generated myth the way a river generated reeds. They said he had rebuilt an entire district with a single decision, that he did not sleep, and that his bank accounts could drown cities. There were darker whispers, too, that he had enemies who left scarred men in alleys, that a family within his orbit had been undone by him because he demanded more than loyalty. He demanded submission. Marina had lived in the shadows of such names, learned to respect them as one learns the names of dangerous predators. When she stood and watched him in the morning, she was watching a man whom the world had given permission to be cruel. One night, a week after she had first slept on his couch, the household buzzed differently. The staff moved with attention she recognized as the prelude to ceremony. Dresses were coaxed into shape. A car with darkened windows drew up like a silent wail. Aiden's expression held a hardness that made his jaw look sealed. The guest expected that night was a figure from the city's storied elite, someone whose approval could make or unmake ventures. Marina had never seen such orchestration in her life. She had been awake in laundromats at that hour, counting socks and watching the spin. She should have been invisible that night, sealed into her room like a secret. Instead, a child of habit, a kindness that had no plan, sent 3 of the household staff to bring her down and offer a seat at a table in the parlor. The request was made with soft efficiency, as if this was a normal courtesy to be extended to any house guest. Marina felt every eye in the drawing room pivot toward her, like a compass finding north. She imagined the conversations that would name her: interloper, charity recipient, the street girl. She wanted to sink into the floor and become earth. Aiden watched the room, and then, with a motion that made the air in her bones rearrange, he crossed to where she sat. There was a polite silence when he took her hand, as if his touch was the permission of the room, and the way he placed her beside him was not tender, not exactly, but it gave her an acknowledgement she had not had in years. People spoke in the social cadence of the city, pleasantries like currency, jokes polished by repetition. Marina answered when spoken to with the economy of someone who knew silence often saved the sum of a life. At some point in the meal, amid clinking glass and the low hum of laughter, an old woman's steward, loyal enough to be part of the furniture, came and drew him aside. They spoke in a tone like low chiseling, Aiden's head tilted, his brow knitting. Marina felt the room shrink to her ears and the sound of a spoon. When he returned, he moved through the circle like someone who had made a decision he had not yet verbalized. "You are staying with me," he said quietly, as if the weight of the decision modestly crushed his words. The sentence had the finality of a law. "Permanently, if you are willing." He watched her while the room waited with the patience of people who had watched empires alter their edges. Marina felt as if the lights had been dimmed and the air compressed into a small cylinder she had to breathe from. Permanently. The word landed like snow. Permanence had been the one thing she had never allowed herself to expect. Her life measured itself in nights, and the way mornings demanded survival. To be offered an end to the itinerant rhythm was almost obscene. For a second, she felt the old wildness ferment into a defiant hope. "Why?" she asked, honest in the way that only those who had nothing to lose could afford. He did not offer a romantic answer. He did not say he admired her strength or that fate required some cosmic balance. Instead, he gave something more dangerous, a reason that was rooted in his own need. "I have a problem a doctor could not solve," he said. "I need someone with patience who understands small cures." Marina blinked. She had not yet become the person who could contemplate being useful in someone else's world beyond cleaning and cooking. Her skill, such as it was, had been learned in secret. Small, careful ministrations with herbs and touch that had soothed fevers in a neighborhood clinic where the volunteer healers could not always be trusted. Her hands had always been better at mending than her mouth. The thought that someone as colossal as Aiden would consider her apt at anything made her laugh, a thin, disbelieving sound. "You are not a doctor," she said, and he smiled without pleasure. "No," he replied, "but you are patient enough to notice the things a machine did not." His gaze was steady, and for the first time since she had known him, it was not cataloging her value, but searching for something. There was vulnerability in that search, a fissure the size of an unlit room. Marina saw and did not know how to name the feeling the sight of it pulled through her. The first time he allowed her to touch him in a way that was not perfunctory, he sat like a king while she warmed a compress and placed it against the tight seam of his shoulder. Her fingers knew herbs he had never been told by physicians. Comfrey for binding, marjoram for softening the edges of old pain, a salve that smelled faintly of moonflower. He did not flinch at her closeness. Instead, he exhaled, a sound like a sword finding its sheath, and let her work. It was an intimacy devoid of romance and full of the trust that grew when a person was cared for without calculation. In that small ritual, he had told her more than words could have. His vulnerability was not the theatrics of a wounded man who asked for sympathy. It was a private fracture. At night, he walked with a limp that disappeared when he stood in front of a crowd. Behind closed doors, he sometimes staggered when the pain came, as if a wire inside him wound too tight. Marina saw the way his eyes closed for a second too long, and when they opened, they carried an apology for a life he had made alone. She began to map his suffering the way she mapped the city. In alleys, it hid in plain sight, but did not announce itself. He trusted her to unpick the small knots in his body that medicine could not reach because he believed, perhaps, that being monstrous in business justified tenderness in private. Each night she worked, she learned the language of his scars. Each morning he compensated with measured smiles and distant commands when he walked the city of his affairs. Between them, something like a covenant formed in silence. She would heal pieces he could not, and he would keep her. For Marina, the arrangement was life-changing and terrifying. The life-changing part was obvious. A bed that did not feel like a borrowed thing, food that did not taste of reheated exclusion, linens that did not carry the scent of other people's pity. The terrifying part was bigger. She had become useful to power. People in power paid attention to useful creatures, and attention could be kindly as it was crushing. She learned to keep one hand on her own boundaries and the other to steady a man who had never learned to be held. Weeks slid into a strange intimacy of calendars and slow confessions. Aiden, who had once been a rumor of cruelty, had a tenderness for order that sometimes looked like love poured into spreadsheets. Marina discovered that he could be generous in the smallest of ways. A book left on the nightstand with a corner marked, a cup of tea that arrived unsummoned. He taught her, without lecturing, about investments and the brutal arithmetic of decisions. She taught him not by instruction but by example, how to let a wound tend to itself instead of being stitched by the blunt instruments of money. Affection had no hurry. It grew incrementally like moss on stone. He began to speak to her of the city not as a boardroom, but as a place with inhabitants with names and quirks. She began to see him as a man, and not only a wall of power, caught in a web that had been spun for him as neatly as a uniform. He confessed once, sitting on the terrace in a night that smelled of rain, that he had been given responsibilities before he had been allowed to feel anything. "Responsibility was my currency before affection," he said quietly. "I have always been paid in it." One afternoon, something happened that made the world rearrange itself around a new center of danger. A letter arrived. Slim, precise, the sort that bore the poison of paper. It was addressed to him and stamped with the insignia of a rival clan that had reasons to dislike the Blackthorns. Aiden read it with fingers that did not tremble, and then closed his eyes. Marina watched the transformation. The man who had chosen to soften when he could now harden at a single line. The letter spoke of debts unpaid and favors called in, and its edges were a map of long, slow threats. He did not tell her all the contents, not at first. He only said that there were forces public enough to unsettle markets and private enough to dismantle reputations. "They will come for weakness," he said. "They have learned to read it." Marina felt each syllable as if it were a step toward something she had no map for. If they came for his weakness, and her skill was his slender remedy, then she sat at the edge of a precipice she had not recognized. That night, as rain drumbeated the windows, she lay awake and thought of the way his eyes closed when pain came. She thought of her hands and what they could do. She thought of the city and how easily it ruined those it deemed defective. The decision that came did not feel like a defiance of destiny, but the only honest choice. She would not let herself be a liability to the only person who had given her a name and a roof. In the quiet where the house seemed to listen, Marina pressed a hand to her chest and felt the steady, small insistence of her heart. The world had given her nothing. She would make one thing matter. Marina tightened her fingers around the damp linen and waited for the thunder to die down the way it always did, as if storms in the city were shy things that would pass if given the right silence. Rain drummed over the penthouse in a steady percussion, and she listened to it as if it were keeping vigil. The letter had been folded into the hem of her jacket when she climbed the back stairs with Aiden. She had read it 3 times then, and the words had not changed. Debts. Weakness invited knives. Pay up or lose what you loved. The promise in the paper had been cruelly specific about ruin. She thought of the way staff moved in Aiden Blackthorn's house, all precise and unobtrusive, the way his hands had wrapped the blanket around her the first time she had slept on his terrace. That memory was a small, stubborn warmth at her chest. It had been a warmth, and then a bargain. Shelter, rules, a name that was no longer one of the street. She had told herself she had been pragmatic, that this arrangement was only survival. But pragmatism had a way of loosening when someone else noticed how she worked with herbs, when someone else tilted his head and watched the motion of her hands. Rain slid down the glass, and Marina pressed her forehead to it, tasting metal on the air. She had been the one to peel his scab, to silence the tremor in his jaw when the old medicine could not stop the pain. He had been a closed map, every road inked with scars and restraint. But he had let her come into the places where he ached. In return, he had given her space and security, men who called her by name without the usual sneer, clothes that fit, a bed that did not creak. Safety had felt like a rare bowl of soup after hunger. It had not been love. She had told herself that until her chest hurt when he was gone. And now the paper said they were targets. Marina had seen the warning look in the staff when Aiden's jaw flexed at the dining table and their eyes dropped away from his face. She had seen the way men who owed him spoke softly in corridors. Threats had a way of turning people inward. They planned, they calculated, they kept their strength. She knew enough of that instinct, enough to know that she could become a liability. She had been a liability once, young and broken, and she had learned the hard lesson of not letting other people bear your weight. If she was to stay, she would make her presence matter. She moved through the rooms without making a sound, because silence was its own kind of skill. Aiden had a sleeping chamber that smelled of old leather and iron. His private rooms had the same order as his mind. Marina found the small chest where he kept his nightly medications, the padded gloves, the cloth patches of herbs he trusted. She laid the blanket she had folded over his chair carefully over his favorite book. She had watched him in the small hours, the way he traced the spines of volumes, and then closed his eyes as if touching the paper helped him anchor some wandering thought. She had watched him meet pain with the same economy, drawing breath and measuring the next steps. When he woke, he found her sitting by the window. He had a bruise at his temple that pulsed when he moved. For a moment his expression was unreadable, as exact and clean as carved stone. Then, because he had given her entry into those chambers before, he did not demand explanation. He let his hand rest on his knee while she tested the bruise with the same quiet patience she had given his other injuries. "You were meant to be elsewhere," he said, his voice a controlled register that always carried command. She met his eyes, and there was a new steadiness in hers that had not been there when she had first arrived. "I was meant to be dead in an alley," she thought, more bitter than anyone needed. Instead, she said, "I was on the terrace." He watched her, and she watched the shadows play along the scar that ran down the left side of his face, the permanent call of an old war. "I received a letter," she said, "a threat." A dark thing crossed his features then, something like a shutter sliding across a light. He had a private storm inside that matched the weather outside. "Who sent it?" he asked. "You know," Marina said. It was vague, which she meant. The letter used names that everyone in his world knew. Enemies in the East, a rival clan with a grudge decades old, a creditor that kept impossible ledgers. She felt his fingers tense where they rested on his knee. The aura around him in that moment was dangerous and earnest. He was danger refined into control. She had learned to make room for danger instead of running. He made a slow decision. He called for control of the house. He ordered the gates sealed. More guards. People reassigned. The staff moved like a flock falling into formation. Marina learned to watch him in his element. The way his shoulders narrowed before he pushed the world into order. The way he issued commands that snapped like clean thread. And she listened to what he did not say. He had been scarred before, But there was something else under the scar now. She could see it when he slept. A narrowness near his collarbone that seemed to ache and pulse like a wound that medicine could not name. In the days that followed, the house became a fortress, and she became more necessary to his days than she admitted. He kept his schedule like a series of cogwheels, and she slid her hands between them, smoothing the grind. He resented the reliance for maybe a breath, then accepted it with that same ruthless practicality that had first drawn her in. His vulnerability was not simply physical. It was the small admission he had made once, in the dark after she had applied a poultice and hummed an old lullaby she had picked up as a child. People feared him for the things he could do, and they loved him only when those things lined their pockets. So he had withdrawn, a king in a tower who had fenced his heart with obligations and cold. She began to learn his schedule like a map of tides. He took his coffee at a certain time, his medication at another. He favored the terrace when the wind leaned warm. She found herself awake at odd hours to be near him while he slept, fingers in her lap because she had no right to touch him without permission, but a raw need to be near him anyway. The staff whispered behind closed doors that Aidan Blackthorne had softened at the edges. Marina did not know if she had softened him or if his crust had simply shifted under the pressure of her presence. Either way, she had decided she would not be the thing that brought that shift undone. The rival clan's threats escalated. The second letter arrived as if the first had been a trial run, more explicit, more cruel. It spoke of ruin in terms of name and land. They would not just take property, they would drag his reputation through the mud, and behind reputation came the slow strangulation of alliances. They wanted to show the city that even someone like Aidan could be toppled. The staff were more guarded now. Walkways were changed. Marina had to pass through checkpoints to reach him. He felt vulnerable because people were prize-conscious animals, and the ones who fed them stories had sharpened knives. An attack came quicker than anyone expected. The assault was not at the gate, it was subtler. It was a trap set in the guise of a gathering, a dinner masking as a bridge between houses. They had invited the rival clan's emissary under a flag of civility. Aidan, whose trust rarely bent, had chosen to meet the rival with polish and restraint, and Marina had been seated beside him with the most casual of gestures that had been anything but casual. She was present by his side, hands folded, mouth dry, listening to the hum of polite conversation. Men who had kept their gaze at a polite distance were suddenly too close. The rival called while dessert chilled, a piece of poisoned bread for the people who did not watch the knives. The first sign of trouble was a silence. A man across the table coughed, then did not swallow. The woman's laughter shortened. There was a movement at the end of the table where a hand dropped and did not come up again. The lights flickered. Someone had cut the power. It was the kind of moment that made Marina's lungs tighten because it looked and smelled like the street. The sudden compression, the sense of everyone deciding whether they were going to be the next weakness to be exploited. She did not think about cowardice or heroism. Her brain cataloged symptoms like a ledger, pupils that did not focus, skin that was clammy, breath that hitching like a rope snagged on a branch. She had treated opiates and infections, the old poisons that worked by choking the blood. Whatever this was, it was fast, and it killed through the mouth or the lungs in a way her herbs had no simple antidote for. Panic would have been a vice. She could not indulge it. She reached for what she knew. Aidan reacted like a man who had rehearsed the move many times. He had guards, of course, but there were only so many of them. He swept the nearest stumbling man into his lap, cradled him with a rough tenderness that had been rare in public. Someone tried to pull a blade. Another guard knocked it free. Men shouted. A chandelier swayed dangerously. Marina felt the sweep of adrenaline through the room like a wind. She moved like someone who had always moved like this. First one step, then another. She pressed her palms to the nearest victim's chest, smelling the acuteness of something not of blood, but of engineered stillness. She opened the poultice she always carried, an old linen bundle of willow and feverfew, garlic pressed fine under pressed herbs that had not stopped a poison before, but could slow some things. Then she saw the bruising at Aiden's collarbone, the same narrow ache she had noticed before. It had flared like an answering bell. He had reached for his throat and then steadied himself. When he met her eyes, there had been a wordless exchange that passed between them like flint striking spark. He did not look the way he often looked at her when he was making decisions about the house. He looked smaller, as if the power he carried had a hole in it that she could see through. I said, "Do not be a liability," he had told her once. But here, in the heat and the falseness of the room, the words meant something else. He did not want her to go. He wanted her to stay and fix what was broken. She hooked a finger under his chin and pressed a cool cloth to his throat, because that was what she knew to do for a man whose breath had been choked by a toxin that targeted the airways. Her hands had the kind of steady that comes from never having had the luxury of error. She felt the tremble roll through him and matched it with a hand that would not shake. He was still half savage in the way he held power. A man who could split a fortune from a rival and still weep in private over a lost friend. But he let her touch him here when so few people had that privilege. Outside, the house had become a battlefield, but the battle inside the dining room was quieter and angrier. People fell. They struggled for life in the way the city had taught Marina, savage, pragmatic, inch by inch. She moved from person to person, hands working, whispering herbs into mouths, tearing cloth, applying poultices with the urgency of someone who had stared at damp blankets and tired faces for years. Aiden stayed close, sometimes bracing someone with his broad forearm, sometimes scooping a body into his lap as if the weight of it steadied him. The staff who had been skeptical of Marina before watched her with a grudging awe that made her teeth ache. The poison, whatever its chemical, had a spread Marina did not know how to counter fully. It had been designed to break hearts and markets and reputations all at once, but she had a talent for the margins, for small old things that modern medicine sometimes dismissed. She wrapped cloves of garlic in leaves and tucked them under tongues. She forced tea with lemon and honey into parched mouths. She massaged bruised ribs and steadied breaths. She merited no miracle. She did not intend to make miracles. She intended to buy time. Aiden clapped a hand over her wrist once during the salvage, the gesture brief and tight with gratitude. "You were not meant for this," he said quietly, and his tone held equal parts wonder and accusation. "Neither was I," she wanted to say. "I had been meant for alleys and hunger, for the shivering nights that taught patience like a craft." She said instead, "I will be what you need." He blinked like a man who had left behind the language of intimacy, but had not lost the ability to recognize it. He had to make a choice then, and the choice told her what the rumor mill never had, that his isolation was, in part, a self-inflicted cage to protect himself from forcing others into the line of fire around him. He had always weighed his power against the lives he touched, which had made him ruthless where necessary and often lonely. Now he chose to bend. That was when the rival made themselves visible. They had not tried to kill only. They had tried to unmake him. A tall woman stepped forward from the shadows of the room, her coat cinched tight, eyes hard as polished coin. She raised her chin and offered a toast that tasted like ice. The rival wanted to see the city kneel. They wanted to show the rich man had vulnerabilities, And here was the man bleeding, and there was the outcast who tended him. Aiden stood. He did not draw a weapon. Instead, he lifted his glass and let the room's attention gather like a net. He did not pretend the room was safe. He made it clear that the attack had been expected and that it had been answered, not with hammers and gates, but with something less obvious. He confessed, with a rare, spare sentence, that he had been poisoned, but that his guests were not in mortal danger. He thanked them for their concern and reframed the evening. Some applauded. Some looked at him with renewed calculation. He had repelled the obvious, and that, he knew, had been the point. The rival had wanted spectacle, and he refused to give them vulnerability. Yet there was a thread others could not see. When the woman whose face was like flint left, she left a token behind, a thin silk ribbon knotted under the table, a sign the staff found later when clearing the plates. It was a map, not of geography, but of intent. Someone had marked the rooms with small dots, and Marina's stomach tightened at the implication. They had not attacked to simply wound him. They had surveyed the house to learn where his weaknesses lay. Her presence was known. They had seen her as part of the man they wanted to break. After the scene, when ambulances had come and taken the worst of the wounded, and when the staff had clustered in the kitchen to breathe and curse and count, Marina found Aiden alone on the terrace, rain drying the dust from his shoulders. He had a handkerchief in his hand, and he twisted it until his knuckles whitened. The streetlights painted their faces in shards. He looked at her, and then away, as if the habit of reticence was still his first language. They were quiet long enough that she could hear the city beyond his property line, the world that had always been her birthplace, singing the small, relentless songs of being alive. She felt like someone who had been given a second chance and had not yet properly thanked the giver. Instead, she asked the question that haunted every moment after the attack. If they had marked the rooms, what else might they have found? What else might they use against him? He listened to her, and then, to her surprise, he took her hand. The space between them had not been permission before. It had been toleration. This was different. He put his palm over hers like a seal. "We will change the map," he said. "We will make new rooms and new rules." She felt the weight of that promise. It was not that he was offering her everything. It was that he was inviting her to be part of the shaping of his life, not just an artifact in it. She realized then that the power imbalance between them had lessened in a particular way. He was still a man of vast resources, vast danger. She was still the woman who had known hunger intimately. But they had shifted from an arrangement where he sheltered and she endured to one where she acted and he accepted help. They planned with the sort of cold clarity he specialized in. They divided the house into zones. She would have access to certain areas and not others. She would train a small group of staff in her methods. She would work the nights when the house was most vulnerable. He would not conceal from her what he had concealed before, not because a vow had been pledged, but because he recognized that a secret kept by one could end lives. She had a voice then that mattered. It was an intoxicating thing. The next weeks unfolded with hard, metered work. She taught the cook to recognize early signs of poisoning. She taught the gardener to grow herbs behind high walls, to hide their clues like a thief would hide coins. Guards learned to read a pulse and not just to give it a salve, but to listen to what it meant. The staff who had once watched her with suspicion now came to where she worked and stayed, asking patient questions about simple things like compresses and more complicated things like how to spot a toxin before it became a death sentence. Marina found that teaching was like giving away a piece of her own life and getting it back multiplied. Aiden made a move that startled her. He opened himself to the city in a way he had never done since she had known him. He hosted a public healing clinic in the courtyard, a small thing meant to show that he would not cower from an attack. He invited rivals, enemies, and the indifferent alike. He let people see that he tended the wounded and that he asked for help when he needed it. It was a dangerous gesture. One wrong move, and they could have branded him naive. Marina helped him prepare, arranging the chairs, mixing teas, setting out the small sachets of herbs she trusted for first aid. On the day of the clinic, the city gathered in a way that felt like the precipice of two possible histories. One where Aiden remained an untouchable power who men feared and envied, and one where the man who ruled by force could also rule by stewardship. The rival clan sent observers who masked their intent with bland faces. Others came because they had been curious about the woman who had been given a seat beside the king of finance and scars. Marina stood beside Aiden as people came forward with small ailments, with children who had scraped knees, with men who had been too proud to seek help elsewhere. She moved among them the way she moved among alleys once, but with a different kind of claim on the space. People who had once stepped aside to let her pass now queued to have her touch them, to have her mix the sachets, to have her offer the small, practical kindness of something that made the next few nights less dangerous. Aiden watched from a raised platform. She saw him smile at someone whose hand he had steadied, and it was a smile that belonged less to the legend and more to the man. The rival clan watched, and then the change happened so quietly that no one in the courtyard noticed until the press began to write. The cold woman who had led the earlier attempt was arrested not because Aiden had issued a decree, but because her men had been found with evidence of malfeasance in places a man did not easily inspect. It was small victories first, exposed debts, a ledger stolen from a safe, and then the rival found their pools of allies drying up. Murmurs spread that made her victory less about a single battle and more about the changing tide. The transformation was not immediate. There were nights when Marina woke screaming, the old alleys replaying their cruelty, and there were days when Aiden had to put down his resolve like a heavy tool and go about being ruler. But over the months, the household became a demonstration that a man could keep his power and use it to foster life too. People brought their sick to the courtyard. They told stories about the woman with steady hands and the man who had scars and an unexpected gentleness. Rumors softened into acceptance. Prejudice cracked. One of the rival's men attempted a final brutal act. It was a knife, a blind corner of the house as Aiden returned from a meeting. The assailant had slipped past the gates with a forged pass and had meant to end the man whose choices had undone them. The attack was swift. Aiden moved like a history written into muscle, precise, powerful, and unexpectedly raw. He caught the blade that had been meant for his heart, and with a motion that told Marina of all his unchecked fury, he closed the hand into a fist and broke it. Blood had a way of making kings look human. Marina had been outside the corridor then, carrying a bundle of herbs to the nearest infirmary. She heard the commotion and ran without thinking, a lean memory of the street that put her exactly where she needed to be. The corridor smelled of iron and rain, and the man who had tried to harm Aiden had dropped like a thrown thing. Aiden stood over him, his hand bloodied, face hard as a cliff. He looked up when he heard Marina's breath. For a heartbeat, the world contracted to the two of them, blood and breath, and the hum of life. And then he made a choice that was the kind of choice she had half feared and half prayed for in the same breath. He turned his back to her, an unspoken shield, and he placed himself between her and the man who had been sent to make her a casualty. His shoulders were squared in a way that told every watcher that the man would accept personal harm before he let another die for him. "You cannot be my shield," he said in a tone that did not pretend to be light. He set his jaw. He had always kept himself as the instrument of violence when needed. Now he used it to protect the life that had taught him how to be less alone. She wanted to argue, to insist that she would not be put in the role of a delicate thing to be wrapped, that she had been a survivor long before she had been given a name. But watching him, crimson seeping between his fingers, she saw not the show of power so many expected, but a raw admission of trust. He had chosen to make himself vulnerable rather than to risk her again. He had chosen sacrifice over preservation of the legend. That was a phrase that weighed more than silver. The city was changed slowly after that night. There were investigations, promises, apologies for the way the law had been slow to act. The rival clan fractured when leaders were arrested for corruption that had nothing to do with Aiden but had been exposed by people who had begun to care about consequence. People began to talk about the idea of a ruler who used his reach to lift rather than to crush. It was an idea that took time to breed, and the seed of it had been the small thing she had done: giving herbs to a child, putting a cloth to a wound, refusing to be invisible. Aiden and Marina had to navigate the residual rumors and the changing currents of the city. There were nights that tested them, when old prejudices crawled like mold from the walls. People who could not imagine her as anything but a street wraith tried to humiliate her publicly. He met those attacks with a firmness she had not known he had. A public acknowledgement of her place at his table, a refusal to be shamed by others. He did not make speeches. He made small, repeated gestures, introducing her by name at gatherings, attributing successes to her care, inviting the press in for a morning when she taught the staff how to tend the garden. When the world tried to sweep her aside, he used his reach to put her on the ground and then raise her with his hand. Their bond, once pragmatic, had ripened into something steadier. The mate pull that neither had expected tightened in private moments, a glance that held more than instruction, a touch that promised to linger. Marina had never believed in fate as a gentle thing. Fate had seemed blunt and cruel in alleys, but there was a pull between them that felt like gravity. It did not erase their pasts, but rather drew them into a new orbit where they could exist together and, slowly, be better for it. Then, in a small ceremony that was more like a quiet rebellion than a triumph, Aiden asked Marina to stand beside him publicly in a way the city could not ignore. He placed his hand over hers on the podium during a speech that was ostensibly about trade, and he spoke of protection and mutual responsibility. He called her by a name that was hers alone, not the one given by the streets or taken by hunger. He told the press that she had saved many lives and that she would continue to do so. The camera lights burned like questions, and Marina felt the heat of them, but she did not shrink. He had given her sanctuary once. Now he gave her voice. They were not ceremonious in the way weddings demanded. They had no white dress, no priest with banal words. Instead, they made vows in the small rooms where they had grown to trust each other. In the infirmary late at night, when a child's fever hissed and they worked until dawn. In the terrace where they had once shared silence during a rainstorm. He placed a small ring on her finger, not gold with gaudy jewels, but a narrow band of hammered iron he had had the smith craft. It was both promise and indictment. He would not make himself soft, but he would keep her. The bond that formed between them had a practical side as well. She took the role of steward of his household's health. He took the responsibility for her safety and for the staff who had grown to be part of their family. Their partnership changed the way people thought about power. It was not a theatrical metamorphosis. It was incremental and stubborn like a vine finding a crack in a stone wall. People learned to call her Marina Blackthorne in some circles and found that the name carried weight. It was a small act of acceptance, and it mattered. Months later, after the city had calmed and the rival clan had been substantially weakened, after the staff had re-knit their routines, and the house had become a place people sought help instead of fear, Marina found herself standing in the garden with Aiden on a spring morning. The frost had gone from the leaves. The air tasted like new things. They were quiet together, a luxury that had been rare in both their lives. The sun lit Aiden's scars in a way that made him look less like a monster and more like a map. He took her hand and, for the first time, did not look at the rest of the world while he spoke. There were no titles used. Titles had always been instruments for other people to wield. He said, "I am not good with words that mean forever, but I am good with this. I will keep you. I will keep them from you if they come. I will not let you be broken again." Marina had been broken before. She had been sold, trampled by cold men, left to count nights in doorways. But she had been mended in more ways than one in the months with him. She had learned to keep someone, to stake a claim on safety and then to make it matter. She had learned that being loved did not mean becoming soft. It meant choosing who was allowed to hold your wounds and teaching them how to bandage them. "I will stay," she said. "I will keep you too." He laughed then, a sound she had not heard often and one that lifted like the first light of spring. It was messy with relief. They had been wary of the idea of family. Their histories were littered with fractures. But they began to build one anyway. The household shifted again, this time with a gentleness that felt like a rare currency. Staff who had been children when Marina had first stepped onto the terrace now had their own small families and brought them to be treated. The influence spread slowly, in the way tending a garden does, patient, steady, stubborn. 1 year after the first letter, the city was quieter at the edges where fear had once rusted the gates. The rival clan had not been destroyed, but it had been contained, its ambitions blunted by exposure and by the fact that people no longer feared Aiden as a volcano, but respected him as a man who chose to hold life as carefully as he held power. Marina and Aiden had a small celebration in the courtyard, not of victory over enemies, but of survival, and of a life rebuilt with purpose. They had a child in that first year, an unexpected thing that was as much miracle as it was consequence. The child was small, fierce-eyed, and had more of Aiden's stubborn jaw than Marina's soft mouth. Naming the child was a long and intimate argument that ended with laughter, and the house, which had once been a fortress, learned to absorb the high, small noise of children again. It was messy. It was beautiful. It was a thing both practical and enormous. Marina watched one afternoon as Aiden lifted their child into the light, letting the little one measure the world with those tiny fists. He had once measured the world by ledgers and by fear. Now he measured it by the weight of a life he kept in his hands. Marina's chest ached with an affection that had been impossible to name before. Pride that this small person would know both the kindness and the strength their parents embodied. The city adjusted. There were still those who doubted the woman with a history and the man with a reputation, but their influence had changed the discourse. They launched initiatives. The infirmary expanded. The garden produced medicinals for the poor, and Aiden funded apprenticeships for children from backgrounds that had previously been denied entry into proper trades. The small acts were not purely altruistic. They bolstered the city's health and gave people something durable, the sense that their lives mattered beyond the ledgers. At night, when the household quieted and the child slept in the steadiness of their room, Marina and Aiden would sit on the terrace and look at the city spread like a claim they had both made. They had been people battered by life and had made one another better, not by fixing each other outright, but by learning how to shoulder parts of the other's burden. The mate pull that had started as an inexplicable draw had matured into a companionable, fierce devotion. He would sometimes bridge that old shabby line between them with a hand that rested on the small of her back, and she would answer by leaning into the weight. They spoke often of the pasts that had formed them, the alleys and the war rooms, the loneliness that had been their first language. They spoke of the future with a kind of careful joy, plans for the garden, for apprentices, for a small institute where people could learn to tend wounds, whether those wounds were in muscle or in pride. They did not pretend the city would be perfect. They planned to be imperfect guardians. Marina had kept her promise. She had made her presence matter not by becoming less of herself, but by letting her strengths operate in a new context. She healed in a small, unglamorous way, with compressed leaves and patient touches, and the city had learned to call for her by name. Aidan, who had once condemned attachment as a vulnerability, had revealed his own wounds in a way that taught them both how to be less alone. He had chosen again and again to stand between danger and the people he loved, and Marina had chosen to stand beside him, not as a passive prize, but as a partner with calloused hands and a fierce heart. In the end, their union did not erase the city's inequities, nor did it make their lives a story of uninterrupted bliss. There were hard days when old enemies flared in ugly ways, and when the weight of responsibility felt like a mountain pressing down on them. But there were also days of small, luminous victories. A child's fever abating because of a tea she brewed, a neighbor who found work through a program they started, an old man who sobbed when he was given a clean bed in which to die with dignity. These were the measures of a life that mattered. On the anniversary of the attack, they walked the route that had once been the scene of their near ruin. They walked slowly, their hands intertwined like a knot of habit and determination. People recognized them. They nodded, some with wary reverence, others with genuine affection. A garden bed dedicated to the wounded and the poor blossomed with lavender and feverfew, the same plants that had saved lives that long ago night. Marina knelt and ran her fingers through the soil, feeling the small grit of the city and remembering how close they had come to losing everything. Aidan watched her, and in the way he watched her, there was a gentleness that had been rare in the beginning. He spoke then in a voice that held the thickness of a man who had chosen to be present. "You made this work," he said. "You made me want it." She smiled then, and it was small and honest. "We did it," she corrected. "We kept each other." They stood for a long time in the sun, and the city thrummed around them like a living thing that had been given the chance to breathe in a new way. They had been an unlikely pair, scarred ruler, streetwise healer, but their life together had become something stable and fierce. A home that took in the broken and mended them, a house that taught the city to value life over ledger. When night came, they climbed the terrace together and watched the first stars prick the expanse. The child slept, dreaming perhaps of gardens or of doors left open. Aidan rested his head against hers. The scars on his face were softened by the moonlight. There were still dangers in the world, of course. Threats never completely died. But Marina had a name now that was called with respect. She had hands that could make people live, and a partner who would stand in the doorway if a knife ever came again. They had changed each other in ways that could not be unwound. She had learned that being loved did not make her less fierce. It gave her a stake in more than her own survival. He had learned that power was not a thing to be stored, but a tool to be wielded for the common good. In a city that once celebrated the brutal, they had shown that steady care and hard defense could coexist. It had taken blood and patience and stubbornness. As the year turned, the house grew louder and warmer, replete with small domestic sounds, pots clanging, the child's laughter, the murmur of people who had been stitched back into a larger life. Marina would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and lay a palm over the place on Aiden's chest where his breathing was slow and even. She would hum the song her grandmother had taught her when nights were cold, and Aiden would sleep and sometimes hum back, because the old man inside him needed lullabies just like the child at their center. A year after the rain had first driven her toward the penthouse, Marina had a life she had not imagined possible. She had an institute that trained others, a garden that fed the sick, and a place at a man's side who had proven himself capable of both soft and hard choices. He had kept his promise to protect, and she had kept hers to make herself necessary in the best possible way. They had both been outcasts in different ways, thinking their usefulness limited to survival. Together they had built a network that would outlast them. The house on the terrace was no longer a fortress in the sense of defense alone. It was a place where people came for mending, for counsel, for work. The city shifted its center of gravity. A man once feared had become a kind of steward. When Marina stood on the terrace and looked out over the city, she thought of all the small things that had stacked into a life. A blanket in the rain, a hand that had wrapped it, a chair that had been offered and accepted, a poison that had been met with stubborn remedies, a child that had been born of their shared survival. She put her hand in Aiden's and felt the steady pressure of his fingers close around hers. They had kept one another, and that keeping made all the difference.